Thank you, Paul. That was very, very gracious introduction. I don't think I've ever been described as erudite before. Not even 100% sure I know what it means, which probably means I'm not. But it sounds good, so thanks. That's great. Paul and I actually met at Colorado when I was on the job market. Paul was a graduate student there at the time, and he took me on the most significant cross-country ski trip I will ever go on. I thought at the time it might just be the beginning of great things, but since then I moved back to the Midwest, and what can I say? So I really appreciate it. It was great to see him again, and great to be back at St. Olaf, because I have been here before. I grew up Lutheran in southern Wisconsin, and so knew about the Lutheran colleges in this part of the country, and I actually was in a not very distinguished baritone in my high school choir, which came here. The conductor was educated at St. Olaf, and this was the holy grail for him, so he brought us here, and probably have sung in your chapel about 45 years ago, as it turns out. So it's been a while, but it's great to be back here, and really wonderful to be part of this discussion. I was here at Professor Mulligan's lecture earlier, and I was thinking, would it actually be possible to have two people talking basically about the same thing and to have such a different perspective? I don't think you could do it any more than that in some respects. So you'll hear a real different perspective on income inequality, the Great Recession, and slow recovery. As it turns out, the data are basically the same data, the depth of the Great Recession, the stagnation and the recovery, but the explanation is very, very different. I have one slide in here kind of anticipating there would be some comparisons, and I'll say a bit about that, but do feel free in the Q&A to bring up some back and forth about what you heard earlier this afternoon for those of you who were here. I guess Paul already told you about my sociology role, which I might have explained here. It's very exciting. I'm very glad to be part of it. At dinner, one of your distinguished sociologists who's retiring, Professor Bruce, was described and what he's done and contributed, and I'm very glad to be part of bringing sociology back to Washington University. It was a distinguished department back in the 60s and 70s, but through various administrative decisions was eliminated, and I'm glad to be bringing the issues of race, gender, class, social stratification, and many other kinds of things back to our campus. Okay, so enough for the preliminaries. Let me tell you what I want to talk about today. I'll need my glasses to see this. So I've tried to study over the years what drives economic growth, what causes recessions, and the big movements in the economy. I've done a variety of different things. Paul, very nice to talk about the various papers along the way. Worked a lot on business investment and the financial links to business investment through much of my career, but I shifted my focus to the household sector in the middle 2000s, maybe a little earlier than that. And here I'm going to share my late colleague Murray Weidenbaum's advice. Murray once told me, if you ever make a good forecast, don't let anybody forget it. And this is important for economists who don't do such a great job of forecasting, as you well know. And the work that I've been engaged in with at the time, actually one of my undergraduate students, was looking at the rising household debt and the impact that had on the economy, the way we were fueling so much of our demand growth, our spending growth in the economy with rising household debt. And so by 2005, 2006, he said we could have a really big collapse coming on here, and actually published an op-ed in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in the early fall of 2007, saying that it could be really pretty nasty out there. And as it turned out, unfortunately, that forecast did come to pass. In recent years, we've been linking this work to the really exploding interest around the country and around the world in rising income inequality. And what you'll hear tonight is it's kind of a melding together of those two different threads of research. And thank you, Paul, for mentioning the Institute for New Economic Thinking. They have, in fact, supported basically everything you're going to hear tonight, and I really very much appreciate that support. The state of the U.S. economy is where I want to start tonight and talk about this historic recession. You'll see some similar data to what Casey presented earlier. We do have recent somewhat upbeat news about the U.S. economy, job creation being stronger than it had been for some years, actually. GDP growth may be a bit better. Certainly the U.S. economy is doing better than much of the rest of the world, especially Europe and Japan. And so in some sense, what you hear tonight might be a little bit at odds with this general perception that the U.S. economy is doing pretty well, because there's this other perspective that's come to be known as secular stagnation, the idea that we are not just for a short period of time like a typical recession, but for a longer period of time below where we could be, where we should be in terms of production, in terms of employment. And that actually will be my view, that the U.S. is underperforming relative to its potential. And I want to make the case for that here for you tonight. And then to link in the piece of rising inequality, that it's important for understanding the dynamics that led up to the Great Recession, and it helps us understand where we are right now, this somewhat stagnant recovery. So that's a survey of what you're going to hear. Let me start with just a little overview of the data about the recession and the slow recovery. So you didn't see quite this picture from Professor Mulligan. It's a little different, but I'll show you what's going on. These are something I've used for a long time in my various talks with the Weidenbaum Center. These are the profiles of employment in the recessions of the United States since 1974. So this one, I hope you can see my cursor moving, this V-shaped recession is the 74-75 recession. And all this is doing, oops, I didn't want to do that. All this is doing is tracing, everything's indexed to 100 at the beginning of the recession, then the employment drops, and then recovers back. And I keep tracing it out until employment reaches the pre-recession peak. And come back, cursor. And so, you see these various recessions, just to give some historical perspective, 74, 75, this is the double dip of the early 80s, that blue line. I hope it looks blue to you on the screen. This is the first Bush recession, the Papa Bush recession, that when Clinton coins the term, it's the economy stupid, or whoever, James Carville, whoever did that. That election was right about here. George Bush was saying, stay the course, we're on a recovery. He was right, but it was kind of too late for him. This is kind of surprising. This heavy green line is the early 2000s, which was viewed as a very mild recession. And if you look at the output data, it does look very mild. You hardly see a drop at all. But employment dropped not trivially, about kind of around the average of the other recessions. But it was really the recovery was very slow getting back, and had some interesting implications for what played out in policy, especially very low interest rates that fueled the housing bubble afterwards. Is how that all came together. And if you're interested, we can talk more about that history. I like talking about the history, but what I really want to do is put this historical picture you're seeing there in perspective with the recent experience, which is this. So this is the Great Recession. This is what we've just been through. And you can see that it's something completely different from at least the recession since the early 1970s, and just let me assert that if you went back further, you'd find it still completely different for anything except, of course, the Great Depression. And so if you're looking at the basic things here, this is December of 2007, employment's dropping off, kind of quite significantly, but more or less in line with the previous two recessions until we hit the Lehman Brothers financial crisis in the fall of 2008, when Lehman fails and the government bails out AIG, and there's all this turmoil. And then for a while there, we're basically tracking the Great Depression. If you put similar data up here, we don't have as good numbers, but if you put the best numbers we have for the Great Depression, this looks really scary. We're tracking it, right down there. We had 600, 700,000 jobs lost per month. But then things do turn around in the spring of 2009. This, by the way, is the census, just in case you wondered what goes on there. So, government spending can create jobs, right? Because there you see it right there. They were temporary, not very many. And then we get this long recovery. And, one of my colleagues is here in the audience. He's even given this talk many times. And I've been extending this out further and further and further and further. Finally, I believe it's last May, I was done. So we finally hit the employment level we had at the beginning of the recession in December of 2007. But it took, you can see, it took, over 7 years from the beginning. And it's a time period that's much longer. And actually, if you compared this with Professor Mulligan's slide, he actually adjusted for population growth a little bit, and so he shows even less of a recovery. So there's a good case here that there has really been stagnation in the aftermath of this really deep drop. So that's the Great Recession. Now, this is another slide I put in fairly recently. So this is the official government data on potential GDP, the dotted line, the estimate of kind of the target for the economy where we would be roughly at full employment. And the actual GDP. And so here you see the Great Recession. There's this argument, I would actually push back a bit against this, that we were above potential in the tech boom in the late 90s, dropped below in that recession, but it's really pretty mild in the early 2000s, and then a much deeper drop here in the so-called Great Recession. And then you start to see the recovery, and it does look to be closing the gap somewhat. So I put the numbers on the slide, the 3.2% gap between actual output and potential output as of the third quarter of last year. This is a pretty significant gap. I mean, larger still than any gap you see earlier in these slides, but it does look in some ways like recovery. But if you look at this closely, you see that actually the potential output trend is slowing down in some respects. And I wanted to show you this next slide. I have to explain this a little bit, what I'm calling the dumbing down of potential output. So thanks to the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank, which has a wonderful data source for macroeconomic information, we can actually look and see what the numbers used to look like. And before their revisions, and macro data are heavily revised. And so I went back and looked at the estimates of the third quarter 2014 potential output over time. So the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, does 10-year projections. So the first one I could get was from 2004. And that's what this blue line is. These are all projecting the same quarter. They're all projecting 2014 quarter three. That's the actual number, this kind of yellowish line at the bottom. That's where what they actually tell us the number is. But look where they were projecting. You know, it's just monotonically declining. So when the economy, you see this is especially true after the Great Recession. In fact, in 2007, before the Great Recession, the last year before the recession starts in December officially, there's according to that, we're almost 25% below what they thought we would be in, back at the beginning of the Great Recession. So they've been basically, the actual data have come in weaker. They're kind of squeezing down their estimate of potential as that comes out. And of course, they're going to have some reasons for this, and I don't want to be overly critical, but it does make you think that even that 3.2% gap, the official gap, which would be this number here at the end, that we see right now, at least in my view, likely understates the extent to which we could be doing better. And here the question is, what explains this change? And demography is the most obvious one that comes up. That is that the baby boom generation, of which I stand here as a representative, I was born more or less in the peak of the baby boom. We're getting up there, and so the leading edge of the baby boom is retiring. I'll be 60 in December, and so, not quite ready to retire yet, but do think about it more than I used to. But this is unlikely the reason for this phenomenon, because in 2007, people knew that I was there, and that you would have known how old I was, and it really is no big surprise. They could count the number of us around, so that wouldn't really be the explanation. Now, what could be an explanation is slower capital accumulation. That is, if we had less business investment, reducing the capital stock, then you have a less productive economy, according to standard estimates. But why did you get less investment? You get less investment because of a stagnant economy. So there's a chicken and egg aspect of that. And the other one is declining labor force participation, that you have discouraged workers, people taking retirement earlier than you might have thought, people going on disability at a higher rate than you had before. But why, again, would they do this? In part because, maybe large part because of a stagnant economy. And let's just take a couple of quick looks here. This is business investment, capital accumulation, and you see here two kind of big drops. This is actually the end of the tech bubble. The recession wasn't so bad for output as a whole, in part because we were already getting a consumer boom from my point of view. But investment took it on the chin after the bursting of the tech bubble, so it dropped quite significantly, but recovered very robustly, and then really drops off in the Great Recession. Now, it has recovered pretty quickly. In some ways, you might say that's surprising, but it's a question of what's the relevant trend here, but I suppose if you connected peak to peak, we'd still be a bit below. But you've lost a fair amount of capital in this period of time as the result of this recession. In terms of labor force participation, this is the employment rate, or the ratio of number of jobs to various measures of population. This lower number, I'm sorry, the scale is kind of small here, but this lower series that goes way back is the one you usually see. That's the overall number of jobs divided by, I think it's total population. And this is the increase in female labor force participation between, well, really probably going back to the 1960s. Again, drops in recessions, but continuously upward until the late 1990s, drops off there. But notice it was recovering, that even though the recovery wasn't overly robust in the middle 2000s. This was going back up again. So, had we not had the Great Recession, I can't give you an exact prediction, but there's no reason to think this necessarily was the peak. It might have been able to go higher. Then it really drops off deeply in the Great Recession and has hardly recovered since. And so this is similar to what you saw from Professor Mulligan. This top number is actually just for the so-called prime age 25 to 54 in the economy. It doesn't go back as far. It's a similar pattern, but you see the drop here is exactly the same. This does not look like a demographic thing. It's not old people retiring so much in this context as we go forward. So it does seem like the resources available to the economy, the capital and labor, were compromised by this historic Great Recession. That's the argument here. So this is my case. We could be doing better. The recent news is really more about changes, kind of local changes in overall levels. Yes, we have better job creation. That's a good thing in the last few months that have come through. But we're so far below millions of jobs, from my point of view, below the trend I think we should have been on had earlier trends, continued. Larry Summers, very prominent, at least at some point in his career, fairly mainstream economist, has looked at these issues. He's the one talking about secular stagnation, and he has done some estimates that say the lower capital stock and reduced labor input explains 90% of the change in those potential output estimates I showed you there. So that this economic weakness has reduced potential. It's not some kind of natural phenomenon in a sense, and I don't want to get too deeply into the theoretical differences between Professor Mulligan and myself, but basically his argument is the models he was working with there, the supply and demand picture is one where you're always in equilibrium. Effectively, you're always at full employment, although people might choose because of the tax rates and incentives not to work as much. This perspective is very different. It's saying that we had a nasty problem. It has compromised our ability to produce goods and services, and we could have been doing a lot better. So the economy could have been on a much higher growth path. And I want to try to explain that and get to the core of my talk, but let me just show you one more picture to help motivate this perspective a little bit. So this chart is personal consumption expenditures adjusted for inflation, going back to 1999. And this little blue dotted line here is the simplest kind of trend you can imagine that I just stuck through the data up until 2006, I believe it is, before we started to get some slowing of the economy. And you see it almost exactly hugs the trend. It hardly deviates at all. Here's just a little bit of a dip right there until the Great Recession. This it drops. That's actually a pretty big drop for this series. It tends to be pretty smooth. But the bigger issue is the gap, right? So we were on this trend for some years. The economy was doing okay in this period. Unemployment was relatively low. We were, I could argue we could have even been doing better there, but it wasn't too bad statistically. And so we kind of needed this, right? This is consumer spending. This is the motivation of businesses to produce. The sales to business is at least about, well, it depends on how you measure it, but something between 68 and 75% of it is sales to the household sector. And look what happens, and look how far off we are. This gap, by the way, I should number here. It seems like it to have disappeared. But anyway, it's about $1.6 trillion. That is just under 10% of the economy. So this is another story that says, this economy was not booming. We needed this spending, in my view. We needed this demand to keep the economy at least moving roughly towards full employment. We've fallen off that rate of growth quite significantly. And so that's something I want you to think about as we go in now to the next stage of the talk. So let me talk a little bit about income inequality, debt, and the seeds, how this process sowed the seeds of what became the Great Recession. Okay, so this is a chart. You'll see various versions of this. This is the Piketty size data on the income share of the top 5%. For various reasons I'm not going to go into here for technical reasons, we actually include capital gains. So as a result, realized capital gains, our numbers are a little more volatile in this case, and they drop off quite a bit in recessions because realized capital gains are hit hard in recessions. But the basic story is the same. That is, of course, if you go back further, you'll see this declining. But starting in 1960 up until 1980, you have basically a flat income distribution. It jumps around a little bit. I think I just did the calculations. It goes between 22 and 24%. And so not much is really happening here. Maybe a little bit of a dip in the share of the top 5% in the 1970s. But starting around 1980, and people debate the exact start date, could be late 70s, but probably here it looks like it is closer to 78, 79, you start to get an increase. And there are these little jumps and dips around the recessions, but basically it's a monotonic increase. And you see, even though we did have a big drop in this income share in the Great Recession, it's already, this only goes through 2012, it's already roaring back. 2013, 2014 were pretty good for the affluent. I'd be really surprised if when we see the new data, we don't see this starting to jump up above 40%. So there's been this really significant rise in the share of income going to the top of the income distribution. Now, we use top 5% because of various other data things I'm going to be showing you as we go through this. But if you look at the top 1%, it's even more significant yet. If you look at the top 1/10 of 1%, it's probably more significant. There's this general fanning out of the income distribution at the top. I put on the slide there 15 points with 2 exclamation points. Remember, these numbers have to add to 1. These are shares. If the top 5% is getting 15% more of the income than it used to, then everybody else is getting 15% less. This is a big deal. This is a historic increase in inequality. So that's, you've got kind of these macro phenomena I just talked about, the Great Recession, the slow recovery, and you have this rise of income inequality. How can we link them together? Okay, let me talk a little bit about the middle class, which I'm using broadly. I'm going to define the middle class in a way that many people object to, the bottom 95%. Usually my best jokes are when I don't know I'm going to make a joke. I'm teaching this course together with a sociologist on the American Dream this semester, and we were having this debate about, is somebody at the 95% rich or not, and the student's answer is yes. So the top of that is probably quite affluent, and of course, the bottom quintile, the bottom 20%, 25%, wherever you would cut it off, you would not call middle class. But it kind of gets the main issue here, because at the very bottom, sadly for these macroeconomic purposes, they don't have very much money. So even though the bottom 20% shouldn't strictly be in here, it wouldn't make much difference because there's not enough. If you're weighting by income, it's not going to count for much. And the top 95%, while you could say in a statistical sense that would seem pretty high in the income distribution, I can virtually guarantee you that the vast majority of people who were at the 95th percentile would call themselves middle class. That is about $150,000 to $175,000 in annual family income a year at the current rate. And this is a fine institution and all, but I bet for most of the people I'm looking out there, if you know your family income, you'd probably say, I'm not so far away from that, or maybe in some cases well above it. It would certainly be true at my institution. So, and probably don't think of yourself in some sense as rich or your family as rich. So forgive me, I understand the middle class definition here is a little loose, but if I use that term, you'll see what's going on. I hope you understand the context. So what do the numbers in this table show? These are the real income growth per household, so it's adjusted for size of for the number of households of the bottom 95% and the top 5% over 2 eras. One is this period 1960 to 1980, where income distribution was relatively stable. And not surprisingly, the growth rates, average growth rate per year, are roughly the same. A little higher for the top 5% with this data source, but basically pretty close. So you didn't see much change in the shares. What happens in 1980 is that the bottom 95% drop quite significantly, the top 5% grow quite a bit. So you get this kind of explosion in inequality starting about those. And those again are big numbers. Those are big changes over a 27-year period. So these really compound to show you the kinds of things that the share chart shows before. So income growth slowed. Another factor that actually I didn't identify here, but so much of my own work, but I've learned from some other people that have frankly criticized some of the things that Barry Sinema and I have been doing, correctly so, is they said it wasn't just the change in income growth, it was also the rise in real interest rates in around 1980. The fact that we had really high interest rates of the Volcker Fed in the early Reagan administration trying to control inflation. And inflation fell quite a bit, so that inflation's good for debtors. If you borrow money and you borrow $100,000 and the price level rises and your wages rise, that $100,000 becomes less and less difficult to pay back over time as prices and wages rise. When inflation fell and the actual nominal interest rate, the interest rate on the contracts went up, you had this big increase in the economic burden of debt. And that also hurt the bottom 95%. So what does this imply? That if you have a group of people for whom their income growth slows and their debt service costs or the economic burden of debt rises, what do they do if they don't want to kind of get an unsustainable financial position? They have to cut back on their spending. So a sustainable balance sheet requires a drop in the share of income spent. If you don't do that, you'll see your debt rise in relative income. Now, it doesn't necessarily explode right away, but over time it will be unsustainable. So the question is, did they do it? And the answer is no. They didn't. So this is the standard definition. I'm going to show you a different definition in a few minutes, but of the ratio of consumption in the aggregate to disposable income. So this how much spending out of the money you have left over after you pay your taxes. And the bottom here, if you can't see the data, is the middle 1970s. Again, there's some volatility. We probably are including capital gains again. And actually, if anything, the household sector was spending a smaller share of its money in the first part of the data, which go back to 1948, up to the middle 70s, kind of flat there. And then starting again at the same time, and that's important, you see this start to rise. So they weren't cutting back, at least in the aggregate there was not a cutback. They were going, it was going up, in fact, not down until you get to the Great Recession when it drops quite significantly. I'll have more to say about that later. Here's actually probably more relevant evidence. It doesn't go back quite as far. It's very, very difficult to get these numbers. It took a lot of work to put this chart together. But this decomposes that aggregate into the bottom 95% and the top 5%. And the red line on top is the bottom 95, so-called middle class. The solid red line is their consumption spending. Here, you know, this only goes back to 89. That's the first place we can do this data. You see a modest rise, not overwhelmed, but it's certainly no indication of a drop. A little bigger increase if you go to this, which is called outlays, and that includes the interest payments, and that's probably rising a bit faster. Very different from the top 5%. They're highly volatile, but maybe I'll have more to say about that later. Let me just hold off on that. The bottom 95, anyway, though, did not cut back on consumption. That's the main point I want to emphasize here. Okay, so if you don't cut back on consumption, your income growth is slow, you're paying more in interest, what's going to happen? Your debt's going to explode. How do you pay for it? You borrow. So this is, again, a couple of different lines, but the solid line is the one I want to go with. It's the new data we've been developing. And on top, and it shows, this is the debt to income ratio for the whole US economy. And you see that there was some increase in debt, significant so, in the immediate post-war decades. This is, you know, in my view, a lot about housing and the baby boom, you know, my parents buying their houses, basically, during this period of time. But ultimately, that stabilized. And so by the early 60s, you get it pretty flat, and it stays that way until the late 70s. Again, the point at which you date the beginning of the rise is a bit ambiguous, especially because there was a dip in that early 80s recession. But you get this pretty clear upward increase. You know, once income inequality starts to rise, you get the rise in the debt, and then it really takes off in the housing boom. So it really peaks up here, and then gets to, you know, to this number. These are two different numbers. This is actually our measure is looking at the actual income, the cash flow that households have to spend. This is the more official measure down here, a bit lower, which takes into account things like Medicare payments. So if my mother-in-law gets her medical costs covered by Medicare, the government counts that as income, and we take that out of there for this purpose. And so there's a lot of, there's no need to go into those technical details. You get the same story whether you look at the official measure or our adjusted measure. In this case, the notion that ultimately debt was on an unsustainable trend, it seems clear. And there's no coincidence that this is the Great Recession when finally it turns over. So this is a similar kind of data, but now looking at this by income group. So again, disaggregating. We don't have as much data. We only get these numbers well, initially it was only like in 83, and then again, not until I believe it's 89. And then every 3 years after. This is from the Survey of Consumer Finance. And you see the growth is the bottom 95%, the red line. I somewhat discount this first observation. I think this first year is is harder to compare. But very little change in the debt income ratio for the top 5%. The growth is down here in the so-called middle class. So it's that group that's taking on the debt. Not surprisingly, but it's important to look at the numbers. Okay, so what is this that happened? In earlier work, I've called this with Barry the consumer age, this period from around 1980, the early 1980s, until the Great Recession, a period when you have reasonably strong consumption spending but stagnant income growth. And the result is a deterioration of the household balance sheet, this rising debt-to-income ratio. Ultimately, it was unsustainable, but it kept stimulating the economy for 20 plus years during this period. And it was ultimately when that process broke, and why it broke is something I don't have a lot of detail on here, but we could talk about in the Q&A period. But mentioning things like some increases in interest rates, something basically of people recognizing the financial fragility of the household sector, the financial innovation pushing to extreme levels that couldn't be sustained. But around 2006, and certainly into 2007, and especially in late 2008, you get this collapse. When this happens, this borrowing is cut off very, very quickly. And as a result, we see the collapse in household spending. We drop way away from the trend, as I showed you a few slides ago, of the consumer spending that was really fueling the economy during this consumer age period. And that was the cause of the Great Recession. That was the proximate cause. So, tempted to talk about tax rates and things like that in this context, but this is direct, right? This is right in your face. You don't have to go through calculations and kind of wonder who's really unemployed and who's not, and who's getting SNAP and who's not, and these kinds of things. This is obvious. To anybody that was looking at what was happening. The Lehman crash happens in September of 2008, and almost immediately, in fact, it was probably already happening even before that crash, that it had just gone over we had a sluggish economy in the first months of 2008, but you had issues with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in August that, you get into this, when the financial crisis hits its peak, its peak isn't quite the right word, it's at its worst, that it's the point at which the economy really starts to go down, and the transmission mechanism, as economists would say, is in terms of household spending. And this was historic too. This drop was different from anything seen since the Great Depression. This is not subtle. Now, what about linking that to inequality? Who did the cutback? Where did this happen? Well, here I continued that chart you saw before, so you might have noticed I stopped it before. So this isn't so dramatic, but it's quite significant. It doesn't look so dramatic on the surface, and I'll try to explain why. So you've seen this data before. This is consumption relative to income for the bottom 95%. Up to this point, then it starts going down quite significantly, actually, by historic level. It doesn't look like a falling off the cliff type of thing in this chart, but it's still a pretty significant downturn. Now, here's where I wanted to compare this with the top 5%. So you see this volatility. You get this jump up, and it really jumps up like crazy. I mean, on average, not surprisingly, the top 5% spend a smaller share of their income than the bottom 95. You kind of generally see the black line is below the red line. But that actually reverses for a couple of years right around the recession. What's going on? Well, this is what economists call consumption smoothing. For those of you who are advanced economics students, you've probably heard this term, right? This is the life cycle model, or the permanent income theory of consumption. The idea that people will try to keep their consumption smooth even as their income fluctuates. So when your income drops, you want to kind of keep consumption more or less where it was. What's going to happen to the ratio of consumption to income? It's going to go up. So in a recession, you expect to see a jump. It explains the top 5% really well. This is the early 90s recession. This is the tech bubble bursting. This is the Great Recession. It jumps up, and then after, when the income growth starts up again, you kind of come back down again. The ratio comes back down. So the basic theory of consumption works perfectly fine for 1 out of 20 people in the economy. It doesn't work at all for the bottom 95%, right? According to the theory, they should be up here. Their income was slow, they keep their consumption smooth, but they couldn't. They couldn't do it. They're financially constrained. Their borrowing was cut off. So here's some evidence that there is this kind of distributional link. This was not just something spread over the economy where everybody was the same thing. It mattered where you hit in the income distribution. Here's a bit of a technical thing, but I can't help it because I'm working hard on this, and so I want to tell you about it. So this is the overall demand to income rate that I showed you before. It's the same kind of cash flow stuff I was mentioning earlier, that the government counts a lot of things as consumption that most people wouldn't think of as consumption. In particular, I pay rent to myself according to the government. I never realized that, but apparently I write myself a check every month for my house, and that's counted as my consumption. It's counted as my income. It's kind of nuts, but that's the way it is. Medical spending, government-provided medical payments or third-party medical payments are this way too. That is, the government will count your Medicare payment or your Medicaid payment or the payment of your employer-provided health insurance as income to you, as cash flow to the household, and then that becomes your consumption. Even though you're not directly paying for it, that's that's the way it works. What we have done is adjusted for these things, and another big factor of this is we're not going to take into account people paying fictitious rent to themselves and call that consumption and income, but we will want to talk about residential construction as part of the household sector. That's the way that owner-occupied housing affects demand in the economy. And our adjusted measures, this big green line does that, and look at the drop, right? It's hugely different. This is the standard data, that blue line, and here you can see this builds up more, that really peaks right before, and it just absolutely collapses in the recession. It helps explain the severity. Unfortunately, we don't have the data we need to disaggregate this. So I can't do this by the 5 and the 95, unfortunately. Hopefully we'll get there, but we're not there yet. But it does suggest that if I could disaggregate what I consider the true measure of demand, this drop would look much, much more severe here. I expect that's true, but that's speculation on my part. Okay, so here's my Fazzari versus Mulligan slide, or maybe I should say Mulligan versus Fazzari, because I've got supply or demand. So, you've seen, if you've been to both of these lectures, the kind of polar opposites in terms of the main schools of macroeconomic thought. The supply side versus the demand side. And the supply side, macroeconomics, the idea it's all about the decisions to work and to produce. And that basically unemployment, should it exist, is voluntary. You heard Professor Mulligan talking about productivity a lot. Well, the supply siders like to emphasize what they call technology shocks. The original models were tried to explain recessions as times when the technology actually went backwards, and that reduced labor productivity. And that doesn't kind of fit with most people's view of the world. So they've gotten more sophisticated, and I shouldn't probably put up too much of a straw man in that regard. But there is this general view that the economy's at equilibrium. It's all about incentives to produce and to invest and to start new businesses in that context. And in that context, as Professor Mulligan, did as he could, and he's let me look for ways that I could try to explain why people all of a sudden withdrew their labor supply from the economy. And you assess that for yourself. We can talk about that more. My story is the demand side. It's a spending collapse. That basically what happens, why do businesses produce less? Because they don't sell as much. It's kind of obvious. I mean, I had this discussion with my own students. Let me give you this example. I'm, reasonably well groomed for me. You don't realize that, but I got a haircut last night. I'm usually much scuzzier than this. What happened? I went at 6 o'clock to my barber, and I got a haircut, and he's kind of pricey, and I give him a big tip, so it's $40, and GDP got created that night, right? If I hadn't been there and there was nobody else there, he would have gone home. I bought something, production happened. Had I not been there, he might have been sitting there, I don't know, but he would not have been, there would have been no production, right? Demand creates, at the most basic level, demand creates production. It's easiest with non-durable goods like haircuts to see this happen. And so the basic idea is, at least as a first approximation, that it's the demand side that almost has to drive the economy from this perspective, so-called Keynesian macroeconomics after John Maynard Keynes. And that's the perspective you're hearing now, and so you need to assess these stories. I can make my case here a little bit. I wasn't quite sure what Professor Mulligan would talk about ahead of time, so I put a few things down. The link to the financial crisis. I think that came up in the Q&A. He says, not really, I don't know. It doesn't really seem to be tied up, it's the way it is. The financial crisis, which seems pretty central to the Great Recession, is central to the demand side story. It's very direct. The unemployment benefits, I wanted to mention something about the numbers that he was sharing with you. So remember those numbers a little bit? There were numbers like $600 to $900 a month. That's not a very good wage, is it? Think about that. We're talking about, poverty level wages for probably anyone in some respects, certainly for a family at this kind of stuff. Yes, unemployment does replace part of the wage, but it's not particularly generous. And actually, sometimes I'm not sure about this, so I probably shouldn't say it, but I know in the Missouri case, I've looked at this from my students, that there's a maximum. It's a share of what you made before, so you might not get that much, even in that sense. It doesn't seem, it's, from my perspective, let me not beat around the bush, it's a good thing to provide that level of safety net. So Professor Mulligan talked about that. Safety is a good thing, and I strongly agree with that. But it's not, a great incentive to just sit home and watch TV. Does that say it never happens? No, it probably does happen sometime. But I think that, well, you assess it. You heard my story, you heard the story in this case. The housing bailout was not widespread. We had this discussion. This direct versus indirect is basically what I've been saying, that, the theory, the Keynesian macroeconomic theory that I'm talking about is one, this is what we explain. This is what we do. This is the why Keynesian macroeconomics was developed, to explain this kind of phenomenon. The more classical, new classical equilibrium stories are much more indirect, and they kind of get there, but in having to put lots of wrinkles into the model that might not have been there before. I did predict this ahead of time. I mean, I bragged about that. In fairness, I thought it was going to be worse in 2000. I wasn't as far along on my research at that point, but it was a more modest recession. I was not as clear about the ability of the housing sector to keep pumping that demand out through the middle 2000s. So maybe you shouldn't be that impressed by my prediction when I finally got it right in the Great Recession. I don't know any of these new classical economists who were saying in advance of things like snap changes and some of these things that we're going to have a recession as a result of this. So there is that issue. And then there's a lot of other things. I mean, people ask really good questions about other things. For example, prices and wages. Well, if you have a negative supply shock, as someone said, it's good, and Professor Mulligan praised that student, so you're a good economist. Supply shifts inward, prices should rise. Supply of labor shifts inward, wages should rise. Now, he gave some data about productivity, which I don't want to get too deeply into. I am somewhat skeptical about that. But in general, has there been a big increase in wages? No, that's clearly not the case. In fact, wages are lower. Wage growth fell during this period. Prices fell during this period. There's been more deflation, more concern along these lines, consistent with the demand story. Interest rates are at historic lows, consistent with the demand story. I could go on, but I'm not going to. Okay, so I'm watching my timer click here, and I'm a little bit late. So I was told I could talk as long as I want, but that's just not fair. You should never tell an academic you can talk as long as you want. Then just no way, especially after dinner. Okay, so I want to try to wrap up. Where are we now? Where is in terms of the inequality in the sluggish economy? So I want to talk about the role of inequality, but it's a somewhat nuanced story. It's not as straightforward as a good economist at Washington described it once. I can give his name, Jared Bernstein, who was the economic advisor to Vice President Biden. I appreciate that he's supported some of the work I've been doing along these lines, but he says there's lots of moving parts and he's right. So, but it's a somewhat nuanced story, but I want to try to take you through it here a little bit. So, rising inequality is an obvious candidate to explain stagnant demand. There are two reasons. One really everybody talks about, and one that hardly anybody talks about, but it's also important. The first one is propensities to consume. So this idea, like I showed you in the chart before, that when relatively affluent people consume less of their income, save more of it, than lower income people. So if you redistribute income upward, you're going to reduce consumption, other things equal. That's been talked about for decades, if not centuries, in economics. But the other thing is this marginal tax rates in our modern economy. People argue about how progressive the income tax system is, but it's fairly progressive, at least in these going from, say, the 80th percentile up to about the 99th, and maybe a little further, and then it drops off at the very, very high levels because of capital gains. But you are in general going to get a higher share of income paid as taxes as the economy, as income is distributed upwards, and both of these things are going to reduce consumer spending in this context. Now, so that's the basic theory. It's as simple as that. You have rising inequality, demand slows. Isn't that my story? Broadly, yes. But there is a big problem with timing, and I think one should take timing very seriously. So the demand gap, as I've showed you, really starts really in 2007 before the recession and hits with a vengeance in 2008 and 2009. U.S. income inequality began to rise, again, late 1970s, around 1980. So a big difference in timing in that sense. But here's where the nuanced part comes, that this borrow and spend behavior I talked about postponed that demand drag. That is, to the extent that the middle class, broadly conceived, can borrow, they could offset this effect, at least to some extent. And I want to emphasize here, and sometimes I don't do this enough, was aided and abetted by the financial systems. People will hear this story from me and say, well, what about banks and collateralized debt obligations and credit default swaps and subprime lending? All those things were important. We needed that, right? That's the way it worked. That's the way that the household sector was able to borrow to to postpone the demand drag from, at least in part, this rise in inequality. So we needed that. It's not the inequality versus financial expansion, it's inequality and financial expansion. They are complements, not substitutes in the econ jargon. So, these things work together. What happens in the Great Recession is that middle class demand is forced downward. That in fact, it's forced more into a line. It's forced into a more sustainable situation, which you'd say, well, that's a good thing, isn't it? Isn't it better if people aren't spending in some sense beyond their means? It is, except for the fact that we needed that demand. And that's the conundrum. We needed the demand. We were not a booming economy with inflationary pressures and outrageously low unemployment in 2006 and 2007. We needed the demand we had. When we lost it, we haven't replaced it with anything. And that's the clear point. So, some evidence for this story, which I admit is circumstantial. This issue of causation came up before. It's pulling together this story in a more historical sense than it is, one piece of evidence that actually shows you the clear conclusion. But I want to share with you. First thing is that the demand drag from slow income growth comes from the middle class, comes from the bottom 95%. That we've shown you, or at least that's the argument. But what's the evidence? The debt that we talked about rose when inequality began to increase. Timing is almost identical. Financial fragility was concentrated in the bottom 95%. Which is the group that was falling behind in this inequality situation. When the recession hit, who cut back? It was the bottom 95%, not the top 5%. They behaved just like they did in other recessions, where it was the bottom 95 that was different. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a consumption recovery that's remarkably weak. That now we have high inequality constraining demand growth. And the fix, so-called fix for borrowing, is no longer feasible. Now, I guess it was just yesterday or the day before in the Wall Street Journal, there's a story about new subprime lending in autos and credit cards. A physicist friend of mine sent me an email and said, are we on back on the same track again? Maybe I'll be surprised in this sense. I think for a considerable period of time, we are not going to see the kind of excessive lending to the middle class that we saw prior to the Great Recession. It may come back at some point, but it's going to be a while. For now, I'd say probably not. I'm going to just summarize what's on this slide very briefly. A stronger case for causation is that, and you'll hear people making this argument, I think it's quite interesting, that why did the bottom 95% do this? And what I'm saying is they did it. Well, but the question is why? And part of the answer could be rising inequality. And there's research around it that goes this way. It talks about various kinds of social norms, the idea that people look at reference groups in making their consumption decisions, and they tend to look upward, so that you are looking at the people above you in the income distribution and trying to emulate their behavior. And as such, getting more and more spending, especially if the financial system lets you, right? It requires a financial system accommodation. And I guess I'm almost saying everything on this slide as it is, that in particular I would cite Elizabeth Warren, who, well before this was already talking about how it was becoming more and more expensive to maintain a middle-class lifestyle, with the challenges of two-earner families and the child care and the other home costs that came out of, that now had to be paid for in the market rather than paid for by one of the parents staying home, usually the mother, rising costs for health care, education, the need to pushing yourself to live in the neighborhood where you could get the better public schools, that it became more and more expensive to have what traditionally was a middle-class lifestyle. And so encouraged people to push their spending beyond ultimately maybe what was sustainable, but the financial system let them do it. It did during the consumer age, but it doesn't do that anymore. So I think maybe 3 slides at most, with just a little bit more data to wrap up. We've had a disappointing recovery as a consequence of this, to my view. I wouldn't say it's the whole story, the rise in inequality. I think it's a significant piece of the story. Another factor is you hear this story in terms of the economic recovery. What we need is deleveraging. We need for the debt to get back to a more sustainable level, and then everything will be fine. This argument says that's a necessary but not sufficient condition. Yes, we do need to have deleveraging, and we do need to have a repair of the household balance sheet. But to the extent that we have now are visited by the demand drag from rising inequality, that won't be enough. And so we have bigger problems, deeper structural problems that have to be addressed. This is inconsistent with the call for smaller government, just from a macroeconomic point of view. You've lost this pretty significant hunk of demand from the broadly conceived middle class, and something for the economy to be strong needs to replace that. It probably won't be business investment, because that's more of a follower. They'll invest more when their economy is strong, when they can sell their output. Government would be a possibility. We talked a bit about infrastructure in the earlier session, but that has not been the political climate in which we live. This last point, which I'm going to show you a little data on, is the recovery is relying to a larger and larger extent on the spending of the affluent. Let me just show you a couple of charts. So this is our 95.5 consumption data, but presented in a little different form. We index at the beginning of our sample in 1989 to 100, and look at what happens. So here's the top 5, and here's the bottom 95. And a couple of things. Obviously, the top 5 are growing much faster. So to a larger and larger extent, it's the top part of the income distribution that's driving the demand generation in our economy. This is more than double the growth by the end. Another little more subtle factor here is knowing that even though, not surprisingly, this group was pulling away as their income was growing faster in the 90s, at least the bottom 95 was growing until the Great Recession, and it's just stagnant. So that's, again, the same kind of thing there. Here you see it. There was a clear pause, actually even a deeper drop in the recession itself for the top 5, but they've recovered quite strongly. Again, this only goes through 2012, and I'll bet it's up here right now. And here's another one we've shown, similar kind of thing. These are the shares of total consumption. On the top, it's the bottom 80%. This is the only time I've done this data here in this context, but it's interesting, and the top 5%. And notice this goes back to 89 again. So by now, well, this is 2012, so I suspect these lines have already crossed. But as of 2012, the bottom, the consumption of the top 5% was as much as 4 out of 5, 1 out of 20 top people was as much as 4 out of 5 of the bottom. And so, is this economic democracy is the phrase. Democracy is a big word in this country, and it means, different things to different people. But in the context of, where are we getting how is our economy generating? Is our economy really serving the middle class? That's becoming less and less true. We're becoming more and more driven by the affluent. And, that could work in a pure Keynesian macroeconomic sense, but is it ultimately desirable? That's the question I'll leave you with. I'd be happy to take your questions.